What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Wildlife Cake and Cocktails. I have a wonderful drink here with me. This is the Black Cat cocktail. Fantastic. It is vodka, cherry brandy, a little bit of cola, and a little bit of cranberry juice. And I also have a lovely bit of cheesecake, which is not so themed, but the Black Cat definitely is, because we're going to be speaking with a renowned feral cat scientist here in Australia. So let's get to it. Her name is Professor Sarah Legge. She's a wildlife ecologist, professor at ANU, and principal research fellow at the University of Queensland, also working at the Threatened Species Recovery Hub. Starting with a diverse interest in behaviour and ecology and evolution as well, she spent many years in diverse research and conservation management fields. Much of her work focuses on threatened species monitoring, understanding impacts of fire and feral animals, and management of these risks on a landscape scale. She's been awarded the BirdLife Australia Cerventi Medal for ornithological research and the WA State Environment Award for her regional fire management work, and is a member of numerous conservation advisory committees such as the Christmas Island Cat Eradication Project, BirdLife Australia's Threatened Species Committee, and the Commonwealth Government's Threatened Species Scientific Committee. She also recently co-authored the book Cats in Australia, Companion and Killer by John Warnowski, Sarah Legge, and Chris Dickman, available via CSIRO Publishing as of June 2019. We'll put a link down the bottom there below as well. You can follow the Threatened Species Recovery Hub on Twitter at TSR Hub. Let's bring her in now. Sarah, hi, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Yeah, very well. A little bit cold up here in Brisbane. We've finally passed the middle of the winter solstice, but it is a little chilly. How about you? Where are you in Brisbane at UQ at the moment, or down at ANU?
No, I live in Northern New South Wales, so not too far from you, down near Mullumbimby.
Ah, wonderful. Okay. A little bit chilly down there as well, I imagine, at the moment, but probably not as bad as down
there. Feels freezing.
Probably not as bad as down at ANU in Canberra, right?
Probably not.
Well, I have my lovely Black Cat here and a little bit of cheesecake. How are you traveling? Do you happen to have a cake and beverage as well?
I've got coffee and I've got chocolate, which is my sort of greedy thing of choice.
Ah, perfect. Well, look, I guess we should get straight into it. Through all of these shows, I always do a lot of background research, and obviously I know a lot of your work prior to that as well. You've had quite I guess, long and storied career in ecology, working with a lot of different species, ranging from cooperative behavior and lions to a wide range of birds, including kookaburras, kingfishers in Northern Australia and Papua New Guinea, the eclectus parrots, palm cockatoos, through to working on things like fire ecology and threatened species in the Kimberley region, and obviously much more, including the feral cat issue. That's a really broad range of really interesting topics, right? Like, do you have many like favorite species or group taxa to work on, or do any of those experiences particularly stick out, or are they all fairly fascinating and important to you?
Oh yeah, it's hard to pick favorites, and when you list it like that, it sounds like a sort of ragtag of different things in different places. But there was always a thread that was connecting one thing to the next thing. So for a while I was very interested in social animals. So I had been working as a research assistant for an American academic in Tanzania, working on lions. From there, I moved to Australia, and I wanted to keep working on social animals. But in Australia, the mammals tend to be solitary, but our birds have really high incidence of cooperative breeding. So I switched to working on birds. So it's, transitions like that, like going from lions to kookaburras, seems like a sort of bizarre change, but actually there was a thread of continuity. But in terms of picking favorites, yeah, I've always liked cats. Even as a kid, I would always be rescuing stray cats, much to my mother's horror. And my first job in Scotland, if you could call it a job, I wasn't really paid, was on Scottish wildcats. And then obviously I worked on lions for 4 years. And I've played around with feral cats for a long time now. So yeah, I've always had a thing for cats. I think they're amazing. And I've always had a bit of a thing for kingfishers. They're just, I love the colors, the diversity of colors. And I find their characters really tough and gritty. And I really like that about them.
I guess obviously as well, including our large woodland kingfishers here in Australia, the kookaburras, which you've done some research on too.
That's right. So, you know, it's one of those funny accidents of history where Europeans got the naming rights. But because the kingfisher in Europe is a fish-eating bird, the whole group were called kingfishers. But in fact, most kingfishers don't fish. Most kingfishers are like the kookaburra. They live in dry habitats and just hunt off the ground.
So
But,
those
yes,
woodland ancestral kookaburras and those types of kingfishers are ancestral to the more derived fishy eating kingfishers?
that's right. Yeah, the fish eaters are a derived lineage. Yeah, so the original kingfisher was a sort of ground hunter, like the kookaburra,
Wow.
but smaller. Kookaburra is the biggest kingfisher, or the kookaburras are the biggest kingfishers.
Fascinating. There's a lot of examples like that where you think the taxa might really be European, like mistletoes, right? Mistletoes apparently have their origin in Gondwana, but the most famous one happens to be the European one around Christmas.
Yeah, yeah, lots of examples like that.
Yeah, fascinating. And you also dreamed of being a plant hunter at some point, I hear.
Yeah, as a young kid, I think I was always attracted by the idea of adventure and getting to, you know, exotic places. And I don't know, I must have read something or seen something on the telly, but I thought if I was a plant hunter for Kew, that was going to get me to places that I wanted to be.
Could you explain Kew for the people who don't know about this awesome botanical organization that is Kew?
Yeah, well, it's, you know, it's a very famous botanical organization in the UK. And I suppose particularly during the Victorian era, they would have been doing a lot of their collections around the world as part of that sort of imperial colonial push to gather information. But yeah, it did lend itself to lots of great adventure stories for young kids, I think. And I always found that very attractive.
Yeah, right. And a lot of amazing plant discoveries as well, obviously, too.
Yeah.
So I guess speaking of, you know, as yourself being interested in this stuff as a younger upcoming student and ecologist, do you have any advice for the young ecologist, particularly, I guess, on maintaining a ecological career through, I guess you've probably seen some pretty tumultuous times as well. But even, you know, some of the social challenges that we're seeing today with COVID and with the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the pressures that everybody's facing. How would you do you have any advice even for young ecologists on maintaining a bit of focus or anything like that?
You know, it's hard to give advice because things are changing so quickly. And, you know, with, as you mentioned, all this sort of big world stresses, but also like the whole discipline of biology has changed a lot in my lifetime, and it will keep changing. So there's been a very noticeable shift towards using, you know, more advanced technology and a lot of desk-based approaches to ecology and conservation. But so I think, you know, if you're interested in field ecology, which is where I'm coming from, then I guess that the two things that you want to keep trying to do is to maintain that skill of being able to observe. Not everything can be solved by your laptop. So, you know, you need to spend time in amongst it, soaking it in and learning to watch and notice what's going on. And that, you know, obviously, well, I think that gives you a great sense of stillness and connection to the world, and it's what it's part of what motivates you to keep doing what you do. So I think that's incredibly important. And the other thing, I think, if you're a field biologist or field ecologist, is to make sure you get lots of diverse field experience as early as you can, because it seems to be getting harder and harder to get that kind of just a range of different types of work, different habitat, different animal groups. But, you know, get that early because it'll help you form your own or make decisions about what you want to do. But it's really clear, you know, when you've looked at lots of CVs, as I've done, someone who's got that kind of motivation to go out there, find those experiences and get those skills under their belt, it says a lot about their character. So I think, you know, those two bits of advice: learn to be still in nature and get all the fieldwork experience you can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in some senses that sword cuts both ways, right? Like you want your lab people getting out in the field and seeing the lab or desktop results be truthed and really understand what they're doing in the office and seeing it and kind of getting a feel for it in the field. And the same thing with the people in the field. With the speed of technological and methodological advancements, you want them keeping up as well, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Awesome. And you guys also recently, speaking of, I guess, putting all of this field stuff together, you guys recently put together, along with your co-authors, Cats in Australia, Companion and Killer, recently available in CSIRO Publishing. I got a short description here for our audience. Cats in Australia brings feral cat research together, documenting the extent to which cats have subverted and are continuing to subvert Australia's biodiversity. But the book does much more than spotlight the impacts of cats on Australian nature. It describes the origins of cats and the global spread, their long-standing and varying relationship with people, their global impacts, and their ecology. It also seeks to describe the challenge of managing cats and the options available to constrain their impact. So obviously trying to tie in a lot of different field and lab and historical research here as well, and sociological stuff. So obviously you've got many years in the field of feral cat research. How did you guys go about synthesizing all of that into one book for, I guess, more of a public audience?
Yeah, I guess the audience is a bit mixed. Like it's a very well referenced book. So, you know, if you want to get to the source material for anything, you can easily do it by reading the book. But we tried to write it in an accessible style, I guess, so the audience could be broad. In terms of how you put that stuff together, I mean, obviously when you work in a field for a long time, you've got a pretty good handle on what's out there and what the sort of pertinent topics are. So then it's just a question of, you know, deciding how you're going to structure the book, and then doing the extra research that you need to do to fill the content of the book. And off you go. And it's surprising, like, you know, I would have said I thought I knew quite a lot about cats, but when you have to sit down to write a book, you're often touching on material that you don't normally spend a lot of time thinking about. So I found it extremely enjoyable. So things like, you know, reading a lot of the literature about how cats came to be domesticated, so the origin of cats, wasn't something that I knew the basics, but it wasn't something that I delved into in a lot of detail, and that was a lot of fun.
Right. So like even taking things back to written by some of the old Egyptologists, I hear about the presence of cats in Africa and Egypt and sorry, the Middle East as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right, because cats were domesticated in Egypt. So a lot of our information about cats from those days comes from Egyptologists. So, you know, you're reading some really material that's presented in very different ways. So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. And obviously very important considerations when it comes to dealing with something as contentious as feral cats, right? You guys have it in the title there. It's not just killer, it's also companion, which is so important. It's such a big part of this discussion, is that humans who have pet animals wouldn't want to give them up, nor should they necessarily have to.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I guess how do you find a balance between the conservation message with, I guess, compassion for people and pets? And is a direct, hard scientific approach the best way to go?
I think in this case, the two can be easily reconciled, actually, because, you know, we know in Australia, feral cats, or cats that are let out into the environment, feral or pet, wreak havoc. And all we need to do, if you're a pet owner, all you need to do to stop your pet from wreaking havoc is keep it indoors, or keep it in a secure outdoor area. And if you do that, your cat will probably live longer, will get less diseases,
Right.
won't get injured by cat fights or being hit by cars. So there's actually a very strong welfare argument for containing your cat. So to me, I mean, cats are fantastic pets. And I understand why lots of people love them. I've had pet cats myself. And if you keep them indoors, you're doing your pet a service and you're doing wildlife a service. So it's quite easy to reconcile those two issues, I think. It's interesting with cats because if you look through time, like since they've been domesticated, they have more so than maybe any other domesticated animal. They've really flip-flopped in terms of how people relate to them. So to the ancient Egyptians, cats were sacred. So you weren't allowed to kill a cat. That was a crime, unless of course you were a priest, in which case you were allowed to kill them by the thousands to make mummies, so people could buy them and make offerings. But they were sacred animals. And but then you get to medieval times in Europe, and cats were synonymized with, you know, devil, witches. They were thrown off the tops of towers. They were burnt. You know, terrible things were done to them.
I believe
So
there was
really
also the French cat massacres against the like bourgeoisie cat owners. Is that correct?
I haven't heard that. Tell me about it.
I'll have to try to, but there's actually a book. I'll find it for you. I believe it's called the French Cat Massacre. I'll find it for you after this. But it's basically about various ways that cats have been persecuted by humans throughout history. More so, not so much for their conservation impacts, but because of what they represent in society for whatever reason, which changes throughout time in a really interesting way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I guess for you, reading all that stuff with the Egyptologists and the history, has that understanding of the history of human-cat interaction helped you place cats in an ecological context here in Australia?
Well, a bit, I think, because with cats, although they were domesticated in the sense that the Egyptian priests took control of their breeding and were artificially selecting for cats that they could then kill and sell as offerings. So, you know, that's what fueled the domestication process, that control of the breeding. That's how all domesticated animals have been created, if you like, by controlling their breeding. But cats are a bit different to dogs and horses in the sense that I don't think we got as far through the domestication process as we have with other animals. So, you know, cats find it very easy to step out the door and become wild again. They're not dependent on us in the same way that other domesticates are. And I think that that goes along, well, that basically explains why that there's this continuum between pet cats, stray cats, feral cats, and cats. Individual cats can move along that continuum. They're not perfectly domesticated yet.
Yeah, and I believe there was a study showing that there's a fair amount of gene flow between domestic and feral populations even to this day.
Yeah, certainly between pets and strays. So strays being ferals that live around towns.
Right.
We actually don't have a great handle on how much gene flow there is between urban ferals, strays, and bush ferals, but that would be well worth finding out.
Right. I guess you'd need a decent sample set of some pretty good nuclear genetic data to kind of see where the different integrades kind of, because there's so many of them that it's going to probably be a fairly diffuse gradient and a little bit hard to pin down, I imagine.
Yeah.
Well, look, being so easy to rewild, we do know that there is a fair few of them out there. Previously on the podcast, we spoke with Professor Wynarski about your paper from it's Legge et al. 2017 with estimates on the numbers of cats that are out there, and I believe it was between 2.1 and 6.3 million. Has there been many updates to those estimates, or were they about on the money?
We think they're on the money, and there hasn't been any updates to those numbers. But you know, from that kind of platform, I guess we then did our team did a heap of work to estimate the toll of those cats on different vertebrate groups and invertebrates. And
I think that came to 377 million birds per year. That's about 1 million birds per day. 815 million mammals per year. So that's about 3.1 million per day. Reptiles was a little bit lower, 1.8 million per day. So that was 649 million per year. And this year, just recently, you guys put out one that was a little bit interesting. The frogs, which I never really considered would be really high on the diet, but obviously pretty much everything is. So this is Wojnarowski et al. 2020, Predation by Introduced Cats, Felis catus on Australian Frogs, a compilation of species records and estimates of numbers killed in wildlife research. Basically compiled 53 cat dietary studies looking at the mean number of frogs in dietary samples by the number of cats. And the mean frequency of occurrence was about 1.5%. Not huge, but still the annual estimate is around 92 million frogs. And 30 native frog species. Luckily, no EVNT species were on there. That's threatened species, but this might simply be because, well, first of all, they're a little bit rarer and have smaller ranges, and there's not a lot of dietary cat studies that happened in those areas. I guess there's some future research needed to really understand the conservation impacts of those kind of numbers on frogs.
Yeah, well, really on I guess you can say that across that whole set of studies. So we also did invertebrates. That's come out just recently. And the estimate there was 1.1 billion a year invertebrates.
Right.
So frogs are particularly tricky because a lot of species have quite small ranges. So it's easy to miss them in a cat diet study. But also their remains don't hang around as readily in a cat's stomach as, say, fur does or feathers. So
Right.
it could be underestimated. But yeah, I mean, those numbers are they're very big, so they're always shocking. But the real test of impact is whether that predation is causing populations to decline. And you know, we've got pretty good evidence, different sorts of evidence for cats driving declines in mammal populations. But the evidence for cats driving declines in a frog population, for example, is we don't have good evidence for that. It doesn't mean that they don't, but we just don't have the evidence for it as robustly.
Right. And you guys also did some work to identify exactly what species are most at risk, partly from dietary studies and such. I understand that obviously a lot of the small mammals, small to medium sized mammals, pretty much need complete physical separation for there to be much success.
Yeah, some of them. It depends a bit. It's partly a function of size. They've got to be the right prey size for cats, but also the sorts of habitats that they live in. So the denser, either forest dense or rock dense, the habitats are, then animals living in those areas are relatively protected from cats. But yeah, there's you know, there's a few dozen species that are either at extreme risk from cat predation or very high risk. And really we want to make sure that at least some of those populations have complete physical separation from cats if we want to stop extinction.
Right. And this is just speaking for our feral cats at the moment. As of just recently, April 2020, I believe, you guys put out another fantastic paper, which I'm actually going to bring up here. That's Legge et al. We need to worry about Bella and Charlie, the impacts of pet cats on Australian wildlife. And here we go. So we have the paper right here. Excellent paper, and compiling, again, results from 66 different studies on the impacts of Australia's domestic cats. The average 186 reptiles, birds, and mammals per year, mostly native, at the total of 390 million per year. That's spatially, that adds up between 4.5 to about 8,000 native animals killed per kilometre squared inhabited by pet cats. Across 6 Australian studies of pet cats, around 71.1% roam outside. And that may be an underestimate, obviously, as a study of pet cat roaming behavior found many cat owners mistakenly believe that their pets do not roam outside. Of 177 cat owners who believe their cats were contained indoors at night, 39 actually had high nighttime ranges of over 1 hectare. I found that really interesting. So the per capita kill rate of pet cats is 25% of that of feral cats. However, pet cats live at much higher densities. So the predation rate of pet cats per square kilometer in residential areas is 28 to 52 times larger than predation rates by feral cats in native environments, and 1.3 to 2.3 times greater than predation rates per kilometer by feral cats living in urban areas. Fascinating paper. Yeah, you can see some of these numbers here in this table. Obviously, native mammals, birds, and reptiles in the millions, 66, 79, and 82. Large amounts of predation, large amounts by domestic cats as well, which I guess we weren't necessarily certain about how much predation domestic cats cause compared to feral cats, but seems to be quite significant.
Yeah, it's we're a bit shocked ourselves at that, and I guess we've always been our team, but also I guess conservationists in general and government have been a bit careful about focusing our attention on ferals in order to not make people feel like we were going after their pets. So we haven't really done a lot of work on pets as a result, but we just thought, look, it's time we kind of lifted the lid
and had a look. Yeah,
had a look.
Yeah, and not the best results. And again, obviously, nobody wants to victimize pet owners, but the results do speak for themselves somewhat.
Yeah, they do. And I mean, it's not, when you think about it, it's not that surprising. Like, how many times have you heard people say, oh, we used to have blue wrens in our garden and then the neighbor's cat moved in and they're gone. Like, it is in our experience that cats affect what you see in your garden. So we shouldn't be too surprised.
Yeah. Well, look, luckily, I guess Australia has already some growing public awareness and support for some of these feral cat issues, correct? So it makes things maybe a little bit more easier to manage, and maybe the issue of even domestic cats might make it a bit easier to broach with pet owners in this country.
For sure. So, there's been a bit of work, not by us, by other people, to survey public awareness of cats and support for cat management in Australia and in overseas countries. And Australia tops the charts. So that the Australian public is much more aware of cat impacts and much more supportive of management actions to reduce impacts, not just by ferals, but also by pet cats. And interestingly, even pet cat owners tend to support reducing impacts from cats. So we're in a much better position to do something about cat impacts, including pets. In fact, when you think about it, if only 71% of pet cats are roaming, that means about 30% of cats are already kept indoors. So we already have quite a big fraction of highly responsible pet cat owners.
Right.
We just need to try and increase that fraction.
What is that fraction? Do you know what that fraction here is in comparison to other countries?
Yeah, I can't give you the exact numbers off the top of my head, but in a place like the UK, it'd be less than 10% of cats are kept indoors. I think it might even be less than 5%. It's quite different.
Yeah, right. What do you think is the cause behind that? Do you think it's our I guess understanding of our sensitive ecology here and the amount of education that goes into feral cat issues, or why do you think we're a little bit different in that regard?
Well, certainly those two factors that you mentioned, awareness and education. I guess there's underlying cultural differences as well in the way that people view cats. I think people in the UK would consider it cruel to keep, more likely to consider it cruel to keep a cat indoors. But I suppose that comes back to education. We've had a lot of education here from vets and welfare specialists telling us it's not cruel to keep your cat indoors. Your cat will be fine. And maybe that still needs to happen in Europe.
Yeah. Well, look, I can see it here in Brisbane as a snake catcher and relocator. We do see fairly frequently large carpet pythons eating cats. I believe there was one week in not here in Brisbane, but up in Townsville, where over a week they had, I think, 5 or 6 cats get eaten by scrub pythons that are out there. So not just snakes as well. There's wild dogs. There's all those other risks. I can see that here in Australia with some of those predatory risks. there might be a bit more of a tendency to keep your cat indoors where it's safe.
That's a really good point, actually. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That's a big difference between here and the UK. Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's not a lot of carpet pythons out there, as I understand.
I don't think so.
It's probably a few keepers who've had a few escapes, but I don't think they make it through the winter. All right, well, look, we should move on to, I guess, if there is any solutions towards some of these feral cat crises. So as we've been discussing, indoor humane cat keeping. So the Humane Society of the United States has said that indoor cats can live up to 4 times longer. So I guess in all of that, you need a bit of enrichment. Cats are intelligent animals, right? So I guess, how do you feel about the idea of outdoor cat runs, secure outdoor cat runs, leash walking, or these other ways to get cats outside in a controlled way?
Yeah, I mean, I think leash walking is good for some cats. Other cats are less compliant.
I've personally seen this, yes.
Yeah, it's quite hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, outdoor cat runs, they seem like a good idea to me. I think in a lot of cases it might partly make the owner feel better to know that their cats get outside. I'm not sure how much the cats discriminate between being inside and outside, but I think that if they're behaviorally enriched, sitting at a window watching things on the outside might be as good as being in a cage that's outside. I don't know. But yeah, I think, if you're going to have a cat and look after it properly, keep it indoors, you need to keep it behaviorally enriched for sure. And I guess that maybe is one of the problems with cats, dare I say it, but compared to dogs, there's a perception that cats are an easier pet to look after. So, I think if you're a lazy pet owner, a cat's an easier pet to have because you can one night just not come home till 11 and not worry about the cat that you've left outside.
Right, they're a bit more solitary like that.
Yeah, I think some people maybe don't feel the same level of responsibility to the cat. So, that's probably a behavior change or attitude change in people that we need to address. But anyway, I think, managing the impacts of pet cats technically is really simple. Keep the cat contained, whether it's indoors, outdoors, on a leash, problem solved. Feral cats are much harder nut to crack, controlling their impacts. And so that's still a challenge and will be a challenge for some time. Over the last few years, we've gotten a lot better at it. There's been some new technologies. So there's new bait formulations now, poison bait formulations that are specifically designed to target cats. They're being used quite extensively in WA. The reason that they can be used extensively there is because the poison in the bait is a poison that's found naturally in plants in the southwest of WA. And so that native fauna are tolerant to that poison, but introduced fauna like cats and foxes are not. So if you put this poison in a bait and it's eaten by a numbat, for sake of argument, numbat will be fine.
Right.
Not that a numbat would eat a poison bait, but you get my drift. But if a cat or a fox eats it, it'll die. So that's been used quite extensively in the southwest of WA, and the results look promising. Some of the work that I've been involved in Northern Australia, and now it's been replicated in other places, is showing that if you manage habitat, so by managing fire and grazing so that you maintain a really structurally diverse ground layer, that reduces the hunting efficiency of cats. So that's probably the best thing you can do at scale to reduce the impacts of cats in the tropical savannas and possibly parts of the desert.
Right, is to maintain that ground cover for those little ground dwelling animals. Right.
Yeah, look after the habitat. Yeah.
Right. And look, aside from keeping cats indoors, what are your opinions on things like desexing, predation deterrents such as bells and lights around the collar? Or even things, this is one thing that I obviously speak with a lot of reptile people about, a licensing or permit system for keeping cats, similar as to what you actually need for keeping native reptiles or even poultry.
Yeah, so there's a mix of things there. So that you've mentioned, some of them like the bells and sonic deterrents on collars, all those sorts of things. They're all designed to reduce the hunting efficiency of hunting success of individual cats. Some of them work to some extent, but they don't work completely. So they might reduce the predation rates, successful predation rates, but they won't completely eliminate it. So they don't. You can't beat just keeping the cat indoors. Desexing is important for a slightly different reason. It's just that if you don't desex, and you need to desex before that cat becomes sexually mature, or before the female cat becomes sexually mature. So you need to do it early, like before 5 months of age. If you don't do that, then you end up with unwanted litters, and they're the cats that are more likely to get dumped,
Right.
become strays or feral cats in towns. So desexing is really important. And then the licensing fee, well, there is some councils have registration fees for cats, and I think they're very useful and important because they increase the value of your pet. You know, if you're having to shell out for something, its value increases and you'll look after it differently. But it's a way for the local government to raise in revenue that it can then use on other cat management activities.
Right. I think that was in the figure in your guys' recent paper, which I want to have a quick look at here. As you mentioned, the containment is the simplest and most cost-effective option, which you can see right here. You've got the high cost on the further to the right, and the most effective on the y-axis here. And you can see right there, smack bang in the middle, containment, 24-hour cat containment. And you can see here on the right with a little bit of registration, then the revenue that comes in from that does also help and can be put towards other management things. You can see here though, exclusion fencing. Quite a high cost solution. You can see on the right side figure here. Obviously, also very effective and maybe necessary in some of those more remote areas, I guess.
Yeah, well, there's actually some councils have there's exclusion fenced areas even in places like the outskirts of Melbourne. So it doesn't have to be in remote areas. It can be in urban parklands.
Oh wow.
Near where I live, one of the local council here has got some barrier fencing, so it's not complete. It doesn't encircle bushland. It's just a linear fence. They don't work very well. The cats just go around.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah. So, but yeah, you don't need to be in remote areas to use exclusion fencing. But the trouble with exclusion fencing is it costs a lot to build, and then you must maintain it. Like you need someone checking that fence once or twice a week. So there's an ongoing cost associated with it.
Right. So look, we did mention some of these other solutions, such as managing fire and grazing, managing dingoes, landscape baiting, and there is the new Felix traps as well, which I wanted to get your opinion on. They obviously they seem to have a fairly low rate of misfire. Pretty much, it knows how to target cats and shoots that little gooey ball of toxin towards the back of the cat's neck, which mammals don't groom as fastidiously as cats do, so the cats are very likely to lick it off, and it seems to be quite an effective solution. What about things like the adaptive evolution fast tracking, taking some predator aware individuals and transplanting them to predator naive populations to try to get some adaptive genetics into that population, as per some of the studies from Chris Jolly and Ben Phillips up in the north?
Yeah, there's a bit of a flourishing of work in that area now. So there's sort of, I guess, two different approaches. One has been used during mammal translocation. So before the release, people have tried to train those individuals to be frightened of cats or foxes. So they've given them really, pretty heavy-handed aversion training.
Terrifying them with cats.
Yeah, basically. For their own good. But there's a new sort of avenue of work that's that's underway now, where people are trying to expose the native animals to a controlled level of predation by cats, for example, to try to push selection in that native population towards behaviors or morphology that will help them help the population withstand the predation from the cat. And the results have been, I don't know if promising is the right word. They're in the right direction. So, you know, if you apply that kind of controlled pressure, you do start to see some morphological changes, like bettongs near Canberra were getting longer legs, which probably means they can run faster.
Wow.
Certainly changes in behavior. Some work in arid recovery has documented changes in how shy and bold individuals are. But there's still, so it looks like things get pushed in the right direction, but to me there's still a very big gap between that and individuals in a population that are so predator savvy that the population is actually persisting in the face of, you know, heavy predation by cats and foxes.
Right.
So it's promising work. It's really important work, and important that people do it. It's still unclear whether it will get us to where we want to be.
And I guess it would be fairly difficult to balance the strong enough selection from predation with you know, the amount of predation that actually has a negative impact on population sizes, particularly with the varying sensitivity of certain target species that are going to be in those diverse communities.
That's dead right. And, you know, selection in some cases can take a long time.
Yeah.
So it would be kind of better if you could, you know, have 50 bettongs and say those 5 are the best at recognizing or evading predators. We're going to take those 5 and we're going to breed from them. And then in the next generation, same, we're going to take those 5. You know, that would be really forcing things along, but we can't do that. So it could take a while.
Yeah, sure. And the you also mentioned the idea of gene drives. So gene drives being, for example, adding a genetically modified male into the population who produces more and more males to skew the sex ratio, so there's not as many breeding events. If you introduce a bunch of males that only have male offspring, then eventually you'll have so many male offspring throughout the population that they struggle to find mates, and the population size slowly decreases because of that reduction in reproductive capacity because of these gene drives. Has there been much progress in that?
People are working on gene drives, but not in cats. So they've developed, they've been able to show proof of concept, I suppose, in some invertebrates.
I believe mosquitoes, right?
Yeah, mosquitoes, fruit flies, and yeast, I think.
Right.
This a group working to try and develop this system in mice. So, and I'm not sure exactly where that's at, but the last I heard, they were hitting various technical hurdles. I guess in the transition from sort of invertebrates up to vertebrates. It's got, I mean, it'd be super if we could get something like that to work, but it's not without problems. For a start, selection's always going to be pushing against any system like that. So I can imagine it working potentially quite well in like an island system where you've got a limited population, and if you can get the drive through the population quickly enough, you could eliminate the population. But on a continent, you'd be needing to release new gene drives constantly, a bit like you do with disease, like new strains of disease.
Right. So you're effectively trying to get it to reach fixation throughout the population, and a big widespread population like mainland Australia is a challenge.
Yeah, it would be. There'd be so much selection to get around the gene drive. And there's other issues too, like, you know, that we need to think of, I think, as a society. One is like, can we trust ourselves to use that sort of technology in a responsible way? Will the public even accept something like that? Like, given the reaction of the public to genetically modified food, this is like GMO on steroids. Like, you know,
Yeah, it's putting a
Same thing.
genetically modified feral organism into a population of feral organisms, expecting it to
Yeah,
solve the feral organism population, which people
yeah,
have a bit of maybe mistrust of with the way that biological control has failed before,
that's
or at
it.
least been problematic.
And we need to have, we need to be able to stop it. So, we need to get rid of feral cats in Australia, but not very far away, there are other species, other types of cat that are highly endangered. And if that gene drive could, and we know that lots of cats can interbreed, by the way, small cats are very good at interbreeding. So if the gene drive got offshore
Oof.
into, yeah, so we need to be able to stop it. So there's a heap of issues to solve. I'm not saying that we shouldn't explore gene drives. I think, a potentially really powerful tool. We should explore gene drives, but there's a heap of other issues that we need to consider at the same time.
Right, right. Is there any particular avenue of these approaches that you think is most likely to be successful, or are we just going to have to wait and see?
With gene drives specifically, or
Well, no, I mean of these different approaches. Let's say the Felix traps, guardian dogs, managing fire and grazing, the evolutionary or adaptive training, or gene drives. Do you see more of a light at the end of the tunnel in one of these than the other?
No, I think we're going to need to use a mix of things. Even with gene drives, which sort of holds the biggest promise for being a silver bullet. Like I say, I don't think it could be that silver bullet on a continental scale. So even there, I think, it could be a really important part of the mix, maybe eradicating cats from large islands. So we're going to have to keep using a mixture of these different techniques. But they are, some of them, like Felix's, are new, and the new baiting technology. So we are still innovating, and we are getting better at knowing which technique to use in which circumstance. So we have to just keep pushing along in this kind of in this way of using lots of different methods depending on the situation.
Yeah. Well, look, excellent. I wish you guys obviously the best luck. And is there? I know you probably don't want to give away too many secrets, but is there anything that you're particularly working on in feral cats at the moment that you're excited about that you can tell us about, or is it all hush hush?
No, I'll tell you. We've got a paper. It's in review now, but we did a bit of work to try and estimate the cost of cat-borne diseases to people and livestock. So, to go back one step, cats carry lots of diseases that they can pass to other animals and humans, but they actually carry some where the pathogen depends on the cat for part of its life cycle. So these pathogens and the diseases didn't exist in Australia until cats were introduced. So they're new to Australia.
Wow.
So this is things like toxoplasmosis, sarcocystis, and a couple of other things. So we thought, well, let's have a go at figuring out how much this costs the economy. And so we compiled all the information that we could to do that. We came to a final figure of 6 billion a year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's
mostly
not.
for toxoplasmosis. Is the most
Yeah.
expensive.
Wow, that's not insignificant. So toxoplasmosis, obviously, transferred from cats to native animals, could be really bad, but people get it fairly frequently. Is that the cat
Yeah.
scratch?
No, cat scratch disease is another organism that causes sort of short-term fevers and so on. But toxoplasma is a parasite that infects about 30% of Australians, almost a third of us. And if the symptoms range from nothing, asymptomatic, to death, actually.
Wow.
So you could experience nothing. You could get kind of like a flu for a week, or if you're immunocompromised, you can get all sorts of complications that can lead to death. If you're a pregnant woman and you don't already have toxoplasma and you get infected by it for the first time whilst pregnant, that can cause miscarriage and congenital defects. So they're all very serious health consequences, but the biggest bill from toxoplasma comes from the way it changes our behavior. So there's mounting evidence now that it changes not just in us, but in other animals as well, how risk averse we are. So what that means is that if you look at people, for example, who are involved in car accidents, they're more likely to be infected by toxoplasma in the
Wow.
background. So workplace accidents, the same. People with toxoplasma, there's an association between toxoplasma and a lot of mental health issues, schizophrenia, depression, suicide rates are higher for people with toxoplasma, and it goes on and on. So all of that amounts to a very substantial cost to our health and also to the economy, of course.
Fascinating. Look, I look forward to reading it. So that's in review at the moment. So I guess we'll just keep our ear to the ground and see what happens. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. All right. Well, look, we have to wrap things up shortly, but if you've got time, we'll jump onto a couple of quick new research topics. And we're just going to have a quick look today at two papers. The first one here, and we will jump over right now. Here we go. So starting with Sauther et al. Taxonomic identification of Madagascar's free-ranging forest cats. I'm just going to read this straight from the abstract. Madagascar does not have native wild feliid species. However, distinct populations of free-ranging forest cats of unknown species are known throughout the island, including Ankarafantsika National Park, probably butchered that, Beza Mahafali Special Reserve, Makira Natural Park, and Masoala Peninsula. The Malagasy forest cats are commonly considered invasive lemur predators and competitors with endemic carnivores, as well as a nuisance exotic species that kills poultry. These species may be descendants of African wildcats, European wildcats, and or domestic cats. However, no research on their genetic origin has been published to determine their taxonomic status. Genetic data from short tandem repeat markers, STRs or microsatellites, was assessed for 3 wild-caught forest cats from the Beza Mahafali Special Reserve and 27 forest cats from the, here we go again, the tough one, Ankarafantsika National Park. Bayesian analyses comparing the Malagasy forest cats to approximately 1,900 domestic and wildcat subspecies suggest that Malagasy cats are descendants of domestic cats from the Arabian Sea region, including islands of Lamu and Pate, Dubai, Kuwait, and Oman. Additional genetic influences may descend from India and Pakistan, combined with cultural and historical information. These data suggest that these felid populations are likely to descend from cats that immigrated to the island on trade ships, particularly along early Arab trade routes. So let's have a look at these little guys here. Fantastic looking little cats. You got that beautiful speckled, very well camouflaged forest pattern. And you can see that in A and B. Domestic cat up there on the top, and you can see a bit of mixing here in D with those lovely white feet. Those are some of their sampling locations, and you can have a look at their microsatellite structure here. So this pink stuff down here, I believe, is the Malagasy forest cats themselves, and it does group with these the yellow and the rest of this stuff here, which I believe is those Arabian Peninsula and Middle Eastern cats. Very, very cool paper. Yeah, I guess Sarah, your opinion on these forest cats? They've obviously been there for a while, but they seem fairly naturalized. Is there a point? Is there a point where you think the impacts kind of balance out?
Yeah, I haven't actually. I forgot that you wanted me to read that paper, but I think I can. Sorry, I didn't do my homework.
Neither did I. I only read it briefly.
Yeah. So I guess the issue is like people are wondering whether they belong, whether they're naturalized enough, and they should be looked after, whether they're still ferals.
Right.
You know, that's always a very tricky question. It's such a value-laden judgment, but yeah, I mean, I guess some of the threads that you described or read there is that issue of the diaspora of cats on ships is that is exactly how cats got transported across the world from the Middle East.
Right, and as you mentioned, they do have quite an ability to hybridize, as you saw with that mixed domestic forest cat that we just saw.
Yeah, they're very good. All the small cats can interbreed. So there's 7 species of Felis, and they can all interbreed. And in fact, they can even breed with other genera of small cats.
Wow.
So yeah, so I guess they've And it's interesting that the picture there of the forest cat looks very like an African wild cat, which is the original, which is where domestic cats come from. So I suppose that the issue for Malagasys becomes, well, now they know that it is just it's basically a feral cat that's naturalized and living, unsupported. And then the issue is, well, is it a problem? I guess people have to decide whether it's a problem, whether it's affecting other values that are important to them, and if it is, what they do about it.
Yeah, I guess it probably needs a bit more of an understanding of that suspected lemur predation and how significant that really is.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Okay. Moving on onto our next paper, nice and briefly, so we can all get moving for the rest of the day. And on to Wysong et al. On the right track. Placement of camera traps on roads improves detection of predators and shows non-target impacts of feral cat baiting. This is in wildlife research. So to understand the ecological consequences of predator management, reliable and accurate methods are needed to survey and detect predators and the species with which they interact. Recently, poison baits have been developed specifically for lethal and broad-scale control of feral cats in Australia. However, the potential non-target effects of these baits on other predators, including native apex predators such as dingoes, and in turn the cascading effects on lower trophic level large herbivores, etc., are poorly understood. We examined the effects of variation in camera trapping survey design has on detecting dingoes, feral cats, and macropodids, and how different habitat types affect species occurrences. We then examined how feral cat poison baiting events influences the occupancy of these sympatric species. So they deployed over 80 remotely triggered camera traps over a large area, 2,410 square kilometers in the Matua Indigenous Protected Area in the semi-arid rangelands of WA, and using a single season site occupancy models to calculate detection probabilities and occupancy for target species before and after baiting. So let's have a look here at this trap design. Look at that. That is a lot of traps. So the triangles here you can see are where they placed their camera traps right alongside, let's have a little zoom here, alongside roads, and the circles are placed off roads. So, I mean, obviously, from this scale, it looks like the circles are still on the roads, but this is a very, very large map. So I can imagine that this is basically driving along the road, and at every triangle, you basically set up a camera on the road, and every circle, you got to hike some camera gear out into some scrub. Quite a job, I imagine. Yeah, and let's just have a quick look down here at their results as well. Oh, beautiful habitat shots here as well. You can see the grasslands and woodlands there in WA, even a few captures. Some camels in a lovely emu. Beautiful. Let's go down to here. And you can see along the road, the cat captures are fairly high, right? Macropodids, not so much difference. The occupancy didn't really change too much, but you can see the on-road probability of detection in cats and dingoes much higher. Not too much difference in macropods. So obviously those roadside survey sites seem to be the way to go. Is that something that they also spoke about, these linear movements of a lot of these predators? Is that more to do with the structure of roads just being straight, or do a lot of predators seem to have these kind of linear search patterns?
No, I think so. For a start, I mean, if you've walked through the spinifex habitats, you'll understand why the predators are on the roads. They're not silly. It's like,
yeah, they don't want to get their feet stabbed.
No. They can walk along the roads because they're predators. So a lot of non-predators will avoid roads because they're more conspicuous, they're more visible, and predators are on the roads. So right. It's not unusual to find that predators will use these thoroughfares, whereas prey will not. What you sometimes find is that the big predators use the thoroughfares, and the small predators don't, because they're trying to avoid, in this case, the dingo. So Mike and his colleagues didn't find that here. But in terms of, I think if they're just trying to get to A and B, they're going to go the easiest route. So they'll go a track, they'll use cattle pads. Cats, when they're moving, will often move along the boundaries of, thicker vegetation with more open vegetation, because they like to be able to move stealthily, but pounce when they need to into something that's in the open. So if they're hunting, they'll often be on an edge like that. But yeah, and dingoes, I think they need to move long distances, and if the quickest way to get there is along a road, that's what they're going to use. So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess yeah, in general, ecotones make a nice spot to find a nice diversity of prey as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Another fantastic paper. But I think we pretty much have to wrap it up there. Professor Sarah Legge, thank you so much for joining us. Really enjoyed our chat. Where can people find your book, Cats in Australia, Companion and Killer?
Well, if you go to the online website for CSIRO Publishing, CSIRO Publishing, you can find the book there.
Wonderful. And you'll have some more research coming out. People can keep an eye out for that costings paper, which we look forward to. And they can find you on Twitter at TSR Hub, I believe. Is that all correct?
That's right. Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed our chat. Before we go, what is that cute little thing behind you on the screen? That cute little thing in the...
Yeah, this is a Melamise. He lives just outside my bathroom window, and I mentioned before there's a carpet python that lives out there too. So we try to keep the carpet python fed with the house mice that we catch in the house, so that the carpet python won't eat the Melamise.
Well, look, it's doing a good job of keeping some of your rodents down by the sound of it. Happy little carpet python. Yeah, best of luck to the Melamise. Thank you again for joining us. Really enjoyed your chat, and hopefully if you get some time once this new costings paper comes out, we'd love to have a chat with you again.
That'd be great. Thanks for having me, Jan.
All right, no worries. Cheers. Thanks again. All right, everybody. That's been Professor Sarah Legge, and we shall be back with much more wildlife cake and cocktails very shortly. Thanks for joining us, guys.